All right, King. Today we are going to be starting to take a look at standard of living and levels of development around the world. But before we can dive into the shape of the world today and the state of affairs around the world today, we really got to take a moment to consider the past and consider how we got here. And so today we're going to be doing a couple of different things. We're going to take a kind of back in time trip to history in North America with a little touch of U.S. history in there. And we're going to discuss a little bit about this idea about how the past can shape the future. And that's really kind of what we're going to be looking at here. We're going to be using a text that talks about Christopher Columbus. And it's going to take a moment to focus on a very brief interaction in Columbus's life, kind of the first few interactions that he had with some of the indigenous peoples that he ran into when he thought he was sailing to Asia. Now, the reason that we're doing this is to get kind of some insight into this idea of the past, learning about the past, the story that we hear about the past, and then how the past connects to the future. We've often talked this year about the concept of the danger of a single story. Watched the TED Talk on that earlier. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later on yet this week. But right now, today, we're looking at yet another story about the past, and we're going to see how that story integrates with the future and in the present day as well. So you've got your handout here, and on it, there's going to be a couple of things that you're going to have to do. These first few parts here, the consider, I want you to take a moment and answer those questions thoughtfully. Don't just kind of jot down a couple of words on the page, but, think critically about these two things. It says, consider the following quote, history is written by the victors. So what does that quote mean to you, right? What does that mean? Maybe provide some examples of some context to that meaning. And then how does the past shape the future? I want you to think about that question for a second. How does our past as individuals, our past as a society, our past as a collective, how does that shape our present and the future? Then I want you to think back to last year or fifth grade or just kind of in general, whatever you know about the past. And I just want you to just jot down for a few seconds whatever it is that you remember or know about Christopher Columbus. It can be anything. I'm not looking for anything specific here. Just what do you know and what do you remember? Then once you've done that, it says, as we read the text below, think about the quote above. So I want you to keep that quote. History is written by the victors. I want you to keep that quote in your old noggin. And then as we read, like it says here, let me see if I can get that straight. There we go. As we read, what I want you to do is be considering that quote, history is written by the victors. Keep that in the back of your mind as we read this. And then again, this text is going to provide a different perspective, a different story on the story of Christopher Columbus. And so I want you to keep that in mind as you read it as well. It's one of many stories, and this is part of that quest to make sure that we don't just fall down the trap of a single story. And as you read, you're going to be annotating the text. So that's going to use your old pen. You're going to be annotating with your own thoughts and reactions. And I also want you to highlight passages that stand out to you as interesting, important, or impactful. Not looking again for anything in particular here, but what stands out to you. It's about 4 pages, and that will take you a little bit, and we'll go through some of this together if you want. Otherwise, you can go through it solo. But then when you finish, I'm going to want you to review the passages that you highlighted and select the 3 most impactful. So you're going to be highlighting all kinds of passages, and you're going to go back and you're going to number them 1 to 3. You're going to be sharing those passages either in person if you're in person or not. And then after you have done all of that, and we've had a little discussion, what did the text change about or add to your thinking about the quote? So again, going back to this idea that history is written about the victors, after we've read that, after the discussion, after all of your thinking, what changed about your thinking, or what was added to your thinking, or what reinforced your thinking, or what clarified your thinking, or what challenged your thinking? A lot of thinking going on this morning. There's going to be a lot of wrinkles growing on the old brain noggin this morning. And then lastly, we're going to be taking a look at this map. This map shows 2 things. It shows the Human Development Index and recent colonial control. Human Development Index is a way to kind of categorize and sort countries based on standard of living. We haven't dived into this a whole lot yet, but before we do, just some of the basics you should know. It basically compares education, health, and economy. So your literacy rate, your life expectancy, and your GDP. It kind of mashes all of this into a ranking and into a number, and so that's on the map here. There is a colored version, of course, in Google Classroom. This should get you by, and then it also says recent foreign colonial control. Again, we're looking to see what we can notice and wonder, what connections we can make about the past and how those connections relate to the future. So that's what we got. I'm going to dive in. I'm going to go through this. If you're done, if you're ready to roll, if you think you know what to do, then by all means, rock and roll because you know what to do. But me, I am going to dive in and start reading. I'm going to provide some discussion, and we'll just kind of get to it. So, consider the following quote. History is written by the victors. What does this quote mean to you? To me, I think about this quote in two ways. One, I think about the fact that when a story, an event, when some event, it could be whether it's a game, right, a sports game, or a historical event, but when it's over, we often only hear the story of the victors. We only hear the story of the winning team. That's the story that stands out in our mind by and large. We think about the victor, we think about the victorious side, and we don't often think about the quote-unquote losing side. That doesn't mean we never think about it, but it does mean, to me, that the story that we hear is the story of the winning side. That's one thing that I think of when I hear that quote. And the second thing that I think about when I hear that quote, I think about how the winning side then also has a chance to shape the future. And we're going to see that very clearly here over the course of the next week as we look at colonialism and imperialism, as we look at European colonialism in Africa. And we're going to see how this winning side, this victorious side, then has a chance to shape the future. It has a chance to kind of change the narrative and change the direction of history because then again, they are victorious. And so by changing the future and changing the present, eventually that future becomes the past, right? Eventually the future that we're about to embark in is going to be the past someday. And the winning side, the quote-unquote victorious side, because they are able to impact the future, they are in a way able to shape the history. They're able to shape the past of a place. And so it really means two things to me. Not only just like the story that we hear, but also how by winning, quote unquote, by being the victor, you have a chance to change the future and change the present. And by doing so, you also not change the past, but you shape the past. You shape the narrative of the past. And how does the past influence and shape the future? Well, again, very similar, right? How does that happen? The past, of course, is going to everything builds on everything. It's called this idea of cause and effect, right? And so if we look at the past or the history of a place, we can draw a very clear through line from that past, from that history, all the way up to the present. Because of who we are as a collective, who we are as individuals, we are all shaped by our past. If we have had a very positive past, that will likely lead to a positive future. If we've had a negative past, that doesn't guarantee a negative future, but it definitely changes what our future might look like and what we might have to endure or overcome to get to a positive future. So let's start reading. We already discussed the directions. The Arawaks' impossible task. The Arawak Indians who created Columbus lived in villages and practiced agriculture. Unlike the Europeans, they had no horses or other work animals. They had no iron. What they did have was tiny gold ornaments in their ears. Those little ornaments shaped history. Because of them, Columbus started his relationship with the Indians by taking prisoners, thinking that they could lead him to the source of gold. He sailed to several other Caribbean islands, including Hispaniola, an island now divided between two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. After one of Columbus's ships ran aground, he used wood from the wreck to build a fort in Haiti. He then sailed back to Spain with news of his discovery, leaving 39 crewmen at the fort. Their orders were to find and store the gold. The report Columbus made to the Royal Spanish Court was part fact, part fiction. He claimed to have reached Asia, and he called the Arawaks Indians, meaning people of the Indies. The islands Columbus had visited must be off the coast of China, he said. They were full of riches. Hispaniola is a miracle. Mountains, hills, plains, and pastures are both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers of which the majority contain gold. There are many spices and great mines of gold and other metals. And so for me, one of the things that really stands out is just kind of talking about how Hispaniola is a miracle. That's one thing that really stands out to me as I kind of look back to this. And then what they did have was tiny gold ornaments in their ears. Both of those passages stand out to me as just kind of reflecting to me what I think Columbus's aims were, what his goals were, right? He was on this age of exploration. Like many, he was the first of many European explorers who were setting out to explore, to claim, and to conquer, right? These European countries, they were setting out to North America and Central and South America and Africa in search of not only a new route to Asia, but in search of expanding their empire through trade and through colonization. And so this is kind of setting the stage or setting the table for that. And Columbus is just the first of many of these European explorers and colonizers and conquerors. And you can see that he's very much in tune to what he's encountered. He's talking about all the riches of the island that he has encountered and the people that he's encountered. And you can see that it's very clear that that is part of his aim, part of his goal. Let's read on. By the way, I'm not going to annotate a ton. I'm going to leave that mostly up to you because I want to make sure that you are annotating your thoughts. I'm just doing a little bit of modeling here. You should be highlighting and annotating a little bit more than I am because, like I said, I'm just doing a little bit of modeling here. If the king and queen would give him just a little more help, Columbus said, he would make another voyage. This time he would come back to Spain with as much gold as they need and as many slaves as they ask. Columbus's promises won him 17 ships and more than 1,200 men for his second expedition. The aim was clear: slaves and gold. They went from island to island in the Caribbean, capturing Indians. But as word spread among the Indians, the Spaniards found more and more empty villages. When they got to Haiti, they found that the sailors left behind at the fort were dead. The sailors had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves until the Indians had killed them in a battle. And I just kind of, this passage just jumps out to me. You know, you've got this idea that this group of people that is foreign to the island and foreign to Hispaniola, roaming in search of natural resources, gold and whatever else they can find to send back with Columbus back to Spain. And eventually, of course, the Arawak people and the indigenous people that they encountered, they resist, they fight back. That's only natural, right? You have people coming to your land in search of your own stuff, your own resources. You're not typically going to just be like, okay, sure, take whatever you want. You are going to resist. You are going to push back. And we see that that's exactly what happened. Columbus's men searched Haiti for gold with no success. They had to fill up ships. Returning to Spain was something. So in 1495, they went on a great slave raid. Afterward, they picked 500 captives to send to Spain. 200 of the Indians died in the voyage. The rest arrived in Spain and were put up for sale by a local church official. Columbus, who was full of religious talk, later wrote, "Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." So here, just something that jumps out is sending back 500, and then 200 or 40% died on the voyage, which is just a really high, crazy amount. And just the thought of, being plucked from your home and forced onto a boat and then dying on that voyage, that's really kind of this gut-wrenching thought for me to wrap my brain around. And we see that, again, this unfortunately is setting kind of the first of many of these kind of cause and effect relationships that we're going to see between European explorers and colonizers and indigenous people in the Americas. But too many slaves died in captivity. Columbus was desperate to show a profit on his voyages. He had to make good on his promises to fill the ships with gold. In a part of Haiti where Columbus and his men imagined there was much gold, they ordered everyone over the age of 13 to collect gold for them. Indians who did not give gold to the Spaniards had their hands cut off and bled to death. The Indians had been given an impossible task. The only gold around was bits of dust and streams, so they ran away. The Spaniards hunted them down with dogs and killed them. When they took prisoners, they hanged them or burned them to death. Unable to fight against the Spanish soldiers' guns, swords, and armor, and horses, the Arawak began to commit mass suicide with poison. When the Spanish search for gold began, there were 250,000 Indians in Haiti. In 2 years, half were dead. This whole passage just really resonates with me. You know, this idea that they're given an impossible task, that they were asked to produce something that they literally could not produce because it didn't exist. And then when that happened, the resistance and the fighting and the pressure from the Spaniards just really increased. And we see how they were unable to fight against the Spanish the guns, the swords, the armors, and then this idea of looking at kind of an impossible choice in terms of your future. Fight and face death, or this idea of mass suicide via poison and face death. Not only is it an impossible task that the Arawak people had to complete, but it is an impossible choice that they were asked to make. And then here, when the Spanish search began, there were 250,000, and in 2 years, half were dead, either through violence, through conflict, or also through disease. The Europeans unintentionally brought with them a lot of European diseases, and these diseases spread rampantly throughout the indigenous population who had no natural immunity to this. And so not only was there risk of violence and death at the hands of conflict, but there was risk of death just simply through the transmission of infectious diseases that the indigenous population had no. When it was clear that there was no gold left, the Indians were enslaved on the Spaniards' huge estates. They were overworked and mistreated, and they died by the thousands. By 1550, only 500 Indians remained. A century later, no Arawaks were left on the island. That's crazy to me, right? In 100 years, you go from a, native indigenous population that has no contact with Europeans to being erased, to being wiped out of the historical record, to having no future, right? And we talk about this idea about how the victors write history. And you think about this, Columbus, the Spaniards, the Europeans, they are the victors. They are the true victors in this. And so why don't we know more about the Arawaks? Well, we do today, right? We do know a lot about the Arawaks, but that's probably not the first story that we hear because, again, this idea of the victors writing history. And also, in terms of going back to my earlier thought where I talked about how the past can shape the future, this past absolutely shaped the future for the Arawak people. And unfortunately, it was a very short future, right? It wasn't long until the Arawak people were gone and there were none left, and there was no future because the Arawak community, the Arawak culture died, was killed, and there is no future left. And that, to me, that just boggles my mind, the way that these indigenous populations were absolutely decimated and wiped out following European contact, whether it was through violence, right, through actual all-out warfare and violence, traditional means, or through just simply death by disease and rampant disease spreading that these native populations had no immunity to. It absolutely decimated native populations, and it wasn't just in Hispaniola, in the Dominican, and Haiti, in Central America. It was all throughout North America. A very similar story played out. Where we have European contact, and then after we have European contact, we have just absolute carnage and death and destruction and sadness, and that for me just really just kind of keeps resonating. So that's a little bit on the context, on the background of Columbus's story. Again, one of the stories of Columbus. And then we're going to go into this next portion here where it talks about telling Columbus's story. And this is going to be all about this idea, again, of how the past shapes the future and about how the victor writes history. We know what happened to the Caribbean islands after Columbus came because of Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a young priest who helped the Spanish conquer Cuba. For a while, he owned a plantation where Indian slaves worked. But then Las Casas gave up his plantation and spoke out against Spanish cruelty. Las Casas made a copy of Columbus's journal, and he also wrote a book called History of the Indies. In this book, he described the Indian society and their customs. He also told how the Spaniards treated the Indians. As for the newly born, they died early because their mothers, overworked and famished, had no milk to nurse them. And for this reason, while I was in Cuba, 7,000 children died in 3 months. Some of the mothers drowned their babies from sheer desperation. In this way, husbands died in mines, wives died at work, and children died from lack of milk. My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write. That whole passage is really just a very kind of powerful passage and sticks with me. But that midsection there in particular just really jumps out. Just again, this idea of sheer desperation and this lack of any real viable option about what to do. This was the start of the history of the Europeans in the Americas. It was a history of conquest, slavery, and death. But for a long time, the history books given to children in the United States told a different tale, a story of heroic adventure, not bloodshed. The way the story taught to young people is just beginning to change. Now, I'm still young enough, I think, in my mid to late 30s here. I do remember hearing a very different story about Columbus. And odds are you've probably heard some of this story about Columbus in your own historical past. When I was growing up, I didn't really hear anything about Columbus's negative interactions with the Arawak people. The only negatives that I heard were that, the native people would die due to disease. I heard very little about conflict. I heard very little about enslavement, and I heard a whole heck of a lot about the heroicism, the heroics of the explorers, and what it would take to sail and settle in a new world. And to be sure, yes, there is something to be said about, setting sail, on this months-long voyage to a new foreign land, not knowing what you're going to get. Yeah, that takes a certain amount of bravery and courage. And I understand that and I get that. However, there is also this whole other side of the story that I really didn't hear about until I got later into high school and then early on into college when I started with my history major and started reading more about Native American history and more about the indigenous history of North and South America, of the Americas. And that story started to change for me. And like I said, and like the text says, it's quite possible that you have heard some of this in your own past with your own history classes. And I'd argue, again, that's a good thing because now we're getting multiple stories. Instead of the danger of a single story, we are getting multiple stories, which is hugely important. The story of Columbus and the Indians shows us something about how history gets written. One of the most famous historians to write about Columbus was Samuel Eliot Morison. He even sailed across the Atlantic Ocean himself, retracing Columbus's route. In 1954, Morison published a popular book called Christopher Columbus, Mariner. He said that the cruel treatment by Columbus and the Europeans who came after him caused the complete genocide of the Indians. Genocide was a harsh word. It is the name of a terrible crime, the deliberate killing of an entire ethnic or cultural group. Morison did not lie about Columbus. He did not leave out the mass murder, but he mentioned the truth quickly and then went on to other things. By bearing the fact of genocide and a lot of other information, he seemed to be saying that mass murder wasn't very important in the big picture. By making genocide seem like a small part of the story, he took away its power to make us think differently about Columbus. At the end of the book, Morison summed up the idea of Columbus as a great man. Columbus's most important quality, Morison said, was his seamanship. And then there's just one line in here, I just kind of, as it ties back into our quote, taking the power to make us think differently about Columbus. Again, this idea about the victor telling one story and the victor getting to shape that story and shape that narrative. Right here again, some 300 years later, 400 years later, my math is off, we still have one story being told. And although they start to weave in this other narrative, this idea of Columbus's interaction with indigenous people and leading to genocide and leading to mass death, it's downplayed. And again, the stories that we tell are not only the stories that help inform us about the past, but help shape our thinking about the present and the future. A historian must pick and choose among facts, deciding which ones to put into his or her work, which ones to leave out, and which ones to place at the center of this story. I'm just going to take a moment there because it's a nearly impossible task to include all facts, all perspectives about a particular event, right? There is just so much fact, and so much fact that we know and so much fact that we don't know because it might have been lost to the past. And so a historian's job is to decide which facts, which stories to highlight, which stories to tell. Just like this text tells a different story of Columbus, just like our learning about different groups of individuals, just like our learning about different countries now is going to try and focus on a lot of different facts, right? There's a lot of different facts that weave the story of the world. And as we look at standard of living and levels of development around the world and how certain countries are maybe at a higher standard of living compared to others, there are going to be a lot of factual reasons for that. But it's also important that we don't just focus on the facts. The facts are what they are, but we need to focus, I should rephrase, it's important that we don't just focus on one set of facts. It's important that we focus on multiple sets of facts, right? To get these different narratives, to get a richer, more true, more full picture of the present and perhaps of the future. Every historian's own ideas and beliefs go into the way he or she writes history. In turn, the way history is written can shape the ideas and beliefs of the people who read it. A view of history like Morrison's, a picture of the past that sees Columbus and others like him as great sailors and discoverers, but says almost nothing about their genocide, can make it seem as though what they did was right. People who write and read history have gotten used to seeing terrible things, such as a conquest and murder as the price of progress. This is because many of them think that history is the story of governments, conquerors, and leaders. In this way of looking at the past, history is what happens to states or nations. The actors in history are kings, presidents, and generals. But what about factory workers, farmers, people of color, women, and children? They make history too. I just love this last line, right? So often we hear the story of kind of the main character, like it says, the kings, the presidents, the generals. But what about the history of us, of you and I, right? We are not the kings. We are not the presidents. We are not the generals. We are the workers, the farmers, right? We are the people who are living that history. And I think that helps us to get such a more full and a more rich picture of the past and then of the countries we're looking at. There will be a top-line narrative based on fact that we will look at, but we need to go beyond that top line narrative, in fact, to see these other factual stories, to again not fall into that trap of a danger of a single story, but this rich tapestry of multiple stories. The story of any country includes fierce conflicts between conquerors and conquered, masters and enslaved people, people with power and those without power. Writing history is always a matter of taking sides. For example, this is Zinn, the author, chose to tell the story of discovery of America from the point of view of the Arawaks. I will tell the story of the U.S. Constitution from the point of view of the slaves, and the story of the Civil War from the point of view of the Irish in New York City. I believe that history can help us imagine new possibilities in the future. One way to do this is by letting us see the hidden parts of the past, the times when people showed that they could resist the powerful or join together. Maybe our future can be found in the past moments of kindness and courage, rather than its centuries of warfare. That is my approach to the history of the United States, which started with the meeting between Columbus and the Arawak. And out of this last section here, one line that again just really resonates with me is this idea that if we can find more stories of courage, stories of kindness, of bravery, of the powerless overtaking and fighting back against the powerful, right? If we can look at these moments in our past, that could perhaps, like it says, maybe give us, somewhat of a brighter future. And I'd like to think that we are capable of that. So that's what we've got here today as we are looking through this. We started with this idea of history as written by the victors, and as we looked at a different story of Columbus, and we looked at this idea of how the past is written, what I want to do is just take a moment and first you yourself, you could pause this if you want to, but go back and number your most important passages 1 through 3 and write a brief explanation about why you thought that was the most important. And then, now that we've resumed, what did the text change about or add to your thinking about the quote? Now, if you remember, and it didn't really change my thinking necessarily, because my thinking was already somewhat in line with this idea that not only does the past, is it written by the winner, the victor, and that shapes the narrative that we hear, but it really reinforces for me this idea that the past shapes the future. The stories that we are told in the past, the stories that we lionize, the stories that we read and recite and share, those become the stories that we continue to share in the future. And so, this idea that the past shapes the future, absolutely it does, especially when we only hear one side of the past, and especially when we only hear the side of the victor instead of a more rich, depth-filled, detailed story about the past. And then lastly, I'll just kind of walk through this real quick as we look at this map. I want you to think about, I'm going to have you do this part on your own, but again, think about the story of Columbus. Think about the story of Columbus in terms of how he is one of many European explorers. We know that Europeans explored all throughout South and Central America, all throughout Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, right? We know Southeast Asia, that story exists, and we're going to dive into it more. But just think about that story as well in terms of how it is writing of the past and how it leads to our future. And then there are the 3 questions that we have there for you. I'm really looking forward to all of this. We've got a great resource. We're going to be diving into this book here, Factfulness by Hans Rosling. It's a great story in of itself, and I can't wait to dive into it it with you. I hope you're doing well. Please, please, please let me know if I can be of any assistance or if I can help clarify anything with you. All right, talk to you later. See ya.